Ixas, spring 1945. A fence line cut the world into two halves. On one side, Camp Swiftguard towers, paperwork, nightly counts, the clean geometry of a system designed to control outcomes. On the other, open ranchland, dust, cattle, and men who measured life and weather and work instead of regulations. And right there, at that fence, a rancher named Jack Morrison stood with his hat in his hands and a bunch of wildflowers he depicked from his own land. Across from him, behind the wire, a German woman in prison-issue clothing watched him like the whole moment might be a misunderstanding. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply said a sentence that was too big for the war to stop. "Will you marry me?" No one in Washington had a manual for that, and Morrison wasn't the only one. By the time the Texas heat turned into summer, the camp would receive dozens of similar request names, signatures, forms love trying to become legal in a place built to prevent exactly that. The government would send investigators south, not to look for sabotage, but to figure out how the enemy had turned into neighbors. But that part came later. First, the trains. February 1945. The boxcars arrived in darkness, metal wheels clacking like a cold metronome across Texas rails. The air smelled of cedar and limestone and a kind of heat that never fully left the ground even in winter. Inside the cars, the women pressed their faces to narrow gaps in the wood, watching America pass, in broken fragments. A porch light, a fence line, a distant windmill, cattle shifting like shadows under the moon. They had been taught what to expect. They had been taught that capture meant collapse, that American camps were built out of cruelty, that the enemy fed you fear. So they held their breath and waited for the proof. When the doors opened, the sound was not dramatic. It was simply loud. A scrape of metal, a spill of harsh light, and then voices, boots, clipboards, orders. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan stood on the platform, clipboard in hand. Her posture was the kind you got from too many nights, making decisions with no good options. She watched them climb down, one by one. Some were barely 20. Others, older nurses, clerks, functionaries, pulled from collapsing fronts. Their clothes were what the war had left them. Mismatched, worn, carrying the stains of travel and uncertainty. Brennan didn't stare like a spectator. She stared like a person responsible for what happened next. "Line up," she called. "Single file. Stay together." The women complete and mechanical. And then Brennan began counting. Not casually, not loosely. The way you count when the number matters. 42. Not one case. Not one story. 42 bodies. 42 futures. And in Brennan's mind, that number didn't feel like a statistic. Felt like weight, because if the system failed tonight, it wouldn't fail once. It would fail 42 times. She checked the list. Matched faces. Verified names. A sway in the knees, a delay in the eyes. The posture of people running on fumes. Brennan caught her arm before she fell. "When did you last eat?" Brennan asked. The woman stared blankly, like her mind couldn't find the shelf where the answer belonged. Brennan tried again in German off accent, but functional. The woman blinked and whispered something that sounded like the truth of too many days. "Don't remember." Brennan looked down the line again, faces in the floodlights, hands clenched around small bags, lips pressed tight like speaking might make things worse. Procedure said. "Process first. Fingerprint. Register. Assign numbers. March to barracks." But Brennan's mind did something the manuals never liked. It compared the checklist to the human being standing in front of her, and a thought landed in her head, plain and sharp. The manual has everything except this situation. This situation doesn't exist in the manual. She turned to the guards. "Take him to the mess hall. Now." Before processing. A guard hesitated. "Ma'am, intake. Procedure mess hall. First." Brennan repeated, and her voice made it clear this wasn't a discussion, because Brennan had learned something in North Africa. You could follow the book and still lose the people, and she was not going to watch 42 women collapse just to keep the paperwork clean. The mess hall at Camp Swift had been built to feed American soldiers in training. At 2:00 a.m., it should have been empty. Instead, 2 cooks were dragged out of their bunks and told, in blunt military language, that they had guests. They worked without questions, because in war, you learn fast that questions don't change the clock. Eggs, bacon, oatmeal, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, toast, butter, jam, orange juice bright and unreal. The women filed in and sat at long wooden tables with their hands folded in their laps. They didn't reach for anything. The food sat there like a trick. In their world, food meant ration cards and thin portions. Food meant not enough, even when you were lucky. Food meant counting. Here, in an enemy camp, the tables held more than some of them had seen in months. A woman named Greta Hoffman, 34, a nurse from Hamburg, leaned forward and touched a strip of bacon with one finger. It was hot. Real. She looked up at Brennan near the doorway and asked, in broken English, "This, for us?" Brennan didn't soften the answer. She didn't dramatize it. She just said what was true. "It's for prisoners." "That's you. Eat still." They hesitated. Then the smell did what fear couldn't. Coffee and bacon too. Aromas that didn't belong in the last years of a collapsing Europe. One woman's face crumpled. Another wiped at her eyes like she was embarrassed by the reaction. Then Greta picked up her fork, and the room changed. Silverware began tapping plates. Someone let out a breath that sounded like relief. Someone else began crying quietly, as if her body finally realized it didn't have to hold itself together for another hour. 20 minutes. The only sounds were eating and the occasional soft sob from someone who couldn't quite accept the reality of what her tongue was telling her. Brennan watched, not smiling, not proud gust alert, because she knew something else. Adequate wasn't a victory. Adequate was the minimum, and minimums don't prevent disasters. Camp Swift sprawled across miles of central Texas range. Before the war, this land had been cattle and sky. Then the army arrived. Barracks, training grounds, roads carved into pasture. A new world built on schedules and orders, with Europe collapsing toward surrender. Camp Swift had been given a new job: hold prisoners, move them, track them, keep everything clean on paper. The women's compound sat in a separate section. Wooden barracks, chain-link fencing, guard towers. It looked almost ordinary from a distance. And that was dangerous, because ordinary could make you forget what it actually was. A system. A machine. A place where lives were organized into lists. The next morning, Brennan stood in front of the women and explained the rules. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention," she said. "You will be treated according to international law." She let the translator finish each sentence before continuing. "You will receive food, shelter, medical care, work assignments allowed by regulation." She paused, scanning faces. Some stared at the ground. Some stared straight through her like she wasn't real. "You will also work," Brennan continued. "Some in kitchens, some in laundry, some in administration. Those with medical training may assist in the camp hospital." And went up. A young woman, Maria Vogel, 22, former communications worker, voice cautious. "We were told prisoners work like slaves," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Fields, beatings, no mercy." Brennan didn't flinch. "You're in Texas," she said. "Not a nightmare. Your work will be within the rules, and you will be accounted for." Maria lowered her hand, still not convinced. Because propaganda doesn't dissolve in one speech, it dissolves in small repeated facts. Weeks passed. The rhythm of the camp began to form around them. Morning formation. Breakfast. Work details. Lunch. More work. Evening meal. Lights out. And the strangest part wasn't the structure. The strangest part was the consistency. Breakfast wasn't a single shocking event. It happened again. And again. Food didn't disappear the next day like a prank. It stayed. And that was how the enemy's story began to break quietly, without an argument. Greta reported to the camp hospital. She worked alongside American medics, treating training injuries and illnesses that moved through barracks the way they always did in crowded places. The Americans didn't treat her like a symbol. They treated her like someone who knew what she was doing. They asked her opinion. They listened. And each time that happened, a tiny crack widened in the wall inside her mind, the wall built from years of being told what Americans were. Maria worked in administration, filing, reports, forms. A clerk named Dorothy brought her coffee and asked, almost casually, about Maria's family back in Germany. Not as interrogation, as conversation. And the women began to learn a new kind of fear one propaganda hadn't prepared them for. The fear of realizing you were lied to. Because if the enemy wasn't a monster, then what did that make the people who insisted he was? Then came Sunday. The first rancher arrived at the camp gate in late March. Thomas Crawford, 58, Circle C Ranch. Dust on his boots, hat in his hands. He asked to see whoever handled labor assignments. They sent him to Brennan. He stood in her office, like a man stepping into a church he didn't fully understand. "Ma'am," he said, "I hear you've got German women prisoners here now." "We do. I need help on my ranch. Spring work's coming. I've got hands missing, if the rules allow it. I'd like to request workers." Brenna stared at him. "Mr. Crawford, these are prisoners of war, I understand. And I'm not asking for free labor. I'll pay fair wages to the camp. I'll treat them right." Brennan didn't answer immediately. She'd heard plenty of promises from people who wanted something, so she tested him with a question she didn't expect a rancher to handle. "You know what the Geneva Convention says about prisoner labor?" Crawford nodded, like he'd been waiting for that. "I borrowed a copy from the town library," he said. "Wanted to know what I was getting into. That sentence simple, almost embarrassing, hit Brennan harder than his request, because it meant he hadn't just come to take advantage. He'd come to do it in a way he could defend to his own conscience. Brennan wrote notes. "If Washington approves it," she said, "I'll send volunteers. No one goes who doesn't want to." Crawford nodded once. "That's fair." 3 days later, approval came. Agricultural work was acceptable. Labor shortages were real. The program could proceed under conditions. Brennan called for volunteers. 12 women stepped forward, not because they suddenly trusted America, because monotony is its own kind of prison, because open sky is a kind of medicine, because the fence line felt too close. The following Sunday, the trucks arrived. Crawford returned with 2 other ranchers, Jack Morrison from the Double M, and a younger man, William Hart. Brennan watched from her office window as the women climbed into the truck beds and sat on hay bales. A convoy rolled out. Dust rose, and for the first time since their arrival, those women passed beyond the camp gates. Brennan stood watching until the dust settled. Then she returned to her desk, and the thought that came to her wasn't heroic. It was administrative. If something goes wrong, it won't be one failure. It'll be 42. The manual didn't cover this, but the consequences were very real. And somewhere out on that ranch land, or endless sky something, had just started that Washington would not be able to unsee. The land opened up like a new planet. Greta sat in the back of Thomas Crawford's truck, knees tucked in, hands gripping the wood slats as Texas rolled out in every direction. Grass moving like water, fences marching in straight lines, windmills turning slowly like they had all the time in the world. In Germany, even before the war, the countryside had been tree lines, hedges, roads curving around history. Here, history looked like it had been scraped flat. And the sky didn't feel like a ceiling. It felt like permission. The women didn't talk much at first. They were still prisoners. Their minds had been trained to treat every new situation as a trap. Even the sunlight felt suspicious, too bright, too clean. Crawford drove without hurry, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the window, as if he'd done this drive 10,000 times, because he didn't look at them like trophies or problems. He looked at them like workers he needed, and that Ellen being needed instead of being hated made something shift inside them. They reached the Circle C near noon. The ranch house was low, built of limestone and cedar, with a porch that wrapped around it like an arm. When they rolled into the yard, a woman stepped out, wiping her hands on an apron. Margaret Crawford. She smiled plain, practical, not polite, not performative. "You'll want lunch before we head out," she called to Thomas, then looked at the women as if it were obvious. They belonged in the sentence too. "Come on, as lemonade." The German women hesitated, feet planted like the dirt might punish them for stepping wrong. Greta spoke carefully. "We are prisoners. We should work." Margaret didn't argue like a politician. She answered like a farm wife. They returned to camp at dusk. Truck beds bouncing, dust in hair. Hands sore in the honest way. Hands get sore when you've done something real. Lieutenant Brennan met them at the gate, clipboard in hand like always, but her eyes were scanning for trouble injuries, missing faces, signs the outside had gone wrong. "Everyone accounted for," the guard reported. Brennan held their gaze as the women climbed down. "Good day," she asked Greta quietly. Greta answered with a sentence that sounded like a confession. "Good day." Brennan didn't smile, but something in her shoulders eased. Not because she was sentimental, because every safe return proved her gamble wasn't reckless. Yet, the next Sunday, they went again. Then again, different ranches, different tasks. Fence repairs, water tanks, sorting tools, checking cattle under supervision. Always the same pattern. work, water, lunch and shade. Return to camp, it started to feel normal. And that was the second strange miracle of the program. Normality is more powerful than propaganda. Propaganda is a story you're told. Normality is a story you live. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Horses. Jack Morrison of the Double M Ranch raised cattle, but he also bred quarter horses strong ranch stock. Calm-tempered, trained for work. One late April Sunday, he brought 5 gentle mares into a corral near where the women were working. He leaned on the fence rail, hat tipped back, and called out like he was talking to neighbors. "Any of you ladies know how to ride?" Most of the women froze. Some had grown up in cities. Horses were either wealth or wore nothing in between. But one younger woman stepped forward. Anna Kleine, 23. "I rode as a child," she said. "My uncle had a farm." Morrison nodded, like he'd been waiting for that. "Want to try again?" He gestured toward a pale mare with a white blaze. "This one's gentle. Name's Daisy." Anna approached slowly, hand out, letting Daisy sniff her palm. The horse didn't flinch. Morrison brought out a saddle and showed her the straps like he was teaching a cousin, not a prisoner. "Check your girth. Keep your heels down. Hands steady." He helped her mount, and for the first time since capture, Anna sat above the ground, literally above the situation, on an animal moving under her. Didn't he care what flag she was born under? He led Daisy in a slow circle, then another. After 10 minutes, he stepped back. "All right," he said. "Your turn." Anna breathed out and guided the horse herself. A walk, then a careful trot. The other women stopped working entirely, watching as if they were witnessing something forbidden. Anna's face changed, not dramatically, just unguarded. For a moment, she looked like somebody who remembered what it felt like to be a normal person. "You're a natural, Morrison called. Your uncle taught." "You're right." By the end of the afternoon, 3 more women had tried riding each under supervision, each carefully guided, nothing reckless, nothing hidden. But something irreversible had happened anyway, because the ranch program was no longer just about labor. It had become about trust, and trust, once it appears, keeps growing unless somebody crushes it. When they returned to camp that evening, the women spoke more than usual. Not about politics, not about the war, about Daisy. About how the horse's breath felt warm in the wind, about how the saddle creaked, about the strange quiet of open land. Lieutenant Brennan noticed immediately at evening formation. Their shoulders weren't as tight. Their eyes weren't as empty. It wasn't happiness. Not yet. Not yet, but it was. Movement. And movement is dangerous to a system built for stillness. The next Sunday, almost 20 women volunteered. Double the usual number. Morrison and the others had to turn people away. "I'll come back next week," Morrison promised. "We'll rotate." Inside the camp, whispers spread, not whispers of escape. Whispers of Sundays. Whispers of ranchland. Whispers of air. And in town, the ranchers noticed something too. Crawford told his wife one evening, "They work harder than most hands I've hired." Margaret didn't look up from what she was doing. "Maybe because you're treating them right." Crawford paused, then quietly, "Yeah, maybe that's it." Margaret was silent for a moment longer, then said something that mattered. "Tom, do you ever think about what they've lived through to end up here?" He didn't answer immediately, because he did think about it. He just didn't have words for it. Margaret sighed, then treat them like people, not just workers. And from that point on, the ranch program didn't just feed by, it started feeding something else. A future. By May, ranchers' wives began coming to, not to supervise, to participate. They brought cookies, spare hats, extra gloves, small, practical things that turned a workday into something closer to community. They sat in shade and asked questions in slow English and patient gestures. "What was your home like? Do you have children? What did you do before the war?" At first, the women answered cautiously. Then more openly. Because it's hard to keep someone as the enemy when she's describing her mother's kitchen or laughing at her own bad English. Greta talked about nursing in Hamburg before the heavy bombing. Maria spoke about sitting at switchboards, routing calls through a system that never stopped. Anna described summers on her uncle's farm, riding through fields that smelled like hay and sunlight. The ideology that once felt permanent began dissolving into ordinary details. Reports from Camp Swift began reading. Wrong. Cooperation unusually strong. Colonel Raymond Parker, liaison for prisoner affairs, called Brennan. The concern is fraternization. Sir, Brennan said. They return to the compound every evening. Counted. Accounted for. But while they work, treating them like human beings seems to be improving behavior on both sides. Morale isn't the issue, Parker snapped. Security is, I'm sending an inspector. The line went dead. Brennan sat staring at the phone, because she understood what that meant. The ranch program had been tolerated as labor, but what it had become quietly naturally looked like something else. A social shift. A slow integration. A transformation nobody had written rules for. And when a system sees something it can't categorize, it doesn't celebrate. It investigates. He spent 3 days reviewing files, interviewing guards, walking the compound like he was measuring it for weaknesses. Then he insisted on accompanying the Sunday work detail. They drove to the Double M with 6 prisoners in the truck bed. Simmons sat stiff in the passenger seat, writing notes like the wind itself might violate policy. At the ranch, Morrison explained the day's work, moving a small herd from East Pasture to West 2 miles. Open ground, simple ranch work, but it required coordination. And horses. Simmons' pen paused. You're putting prisoners on horses. Morrison glanced at him like he'd asked where the grass was green. Been doing it for weeks. And if they decide to ride away, Morrison actually let silence sit there for a second. Then he said, calmly, Captain, they don't know this land. They don't know where towns are. And even if they found one, what then? They're prisoners in Texas. Where exactly would they go? Simmons had no answer. He watched. He watched the women saddle up under supervision, watched them work alongside ranch hands with steady focus, watched them help push cattle without panic, without drama, just doing a job. At lunch, Morrison's wife brought food and sat with them in shade. Not hugging anybody, not making speeches, just sharing sandwiches and talking about weather and livestock. Simmons ate apart, writing more notes. On the drive back, he said nothing. At the gate, Brennan met them. Simmons stayed in her office an hour. This isn't standard procedure, he finally said. No, sir. The regulations don't explicitly allow this level of integration. They don't prohibit decent treatment either, Brennan replied. Simmons stared at her. You understand what you're doing, Lieutenant. Brennan held his gaze. I'm running a program that works. Simmons' voice lowered. You're making them familiar. Brennan didn't flinch. Would that be so terrible, sir? Simmons didn't answer. He closed his notebook, stood, and said, I'll file my report. The program can continue for no under additional oversight. He listed requirements like a warning label, weekly reports, quarterly reviews. Any incident, no matter how minor, reported immediately. When he left, Brennan finally exhaled. The program lived. But she understood what understood wasn't written. Washington was watching now, and the line between prisoner treatment and community integration was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. And somewhere out in that ranchland, among horses and fence posts and quiet lunches, something was starting to happen that paperwork couldn't stop. Because sooner or later, people stop being categories. They become names. And when someone becomes a name, Bjarly June's something had shifted that no report could fully explain. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It arrived quietly, in pauses that lasted a second too long, in glances that stayed half a heartbeat after work instructions ended, in the way names replaced numbers without anyone deciding to do that. Jack Morrison noticed it on a Thursday, not Sunday, not during ranch work, but on an ordinary weekday afternoon at the Double M. Anna Clean was learning to rope. Nothing special, just a fence post target, 20 feet out. Morrison showed her the coil, the swing, the release. She missed, laughed at herself, and in that laughing guarded, unplanned Jack felt something stop him. Not attraction first. Recognition. She didn't sound like a prisoner. She didn't sound like an enemy. She sounded like someone who belonged in the moment. Jack adjusted his stance, showed her again. His voice stayed professional. Measured. But his attention didn't. By the end of the afternoon, he knew something was wrong. Not wrong like immoral. Wrong like dangerous, because Anna was still a prisoner, and Jack Morrison had lived his whole life by rules that mattered, spoken and unspoken. You don't cross lines when you hold power. You don't blur authority with desire. You don't take advantage, even accidentally. So he did the responsible thing. He studied Hawaii. The next Sunday, Jack didn't come to the ranch. Thomas Crawford noticed first. "Where's Morrison?" Huskett. "Didn't say?" one of the hands replied. Anna noticed second. She asked casually, like it didn't matter. "Is Mr. Morrison working another section today?" "Guess so," someone shrugged, but she felt it immediately. Absence has weight when it's intentional. Three weeks passed. The work continued. The ranch program expanded. Washington sent more memos. Lieutenant Brennan filed longer reports, but something personal had been paused. Jack stayed away because he believed distance was the only ethical answer. Because if it were forbidden but meaningless, it would be easy. He just knew that. Not saying anything was starting to feel like dishonesty. He got out of the truck and stood several feet away. No touching. No stepping closer. No bending rules. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said. And I didn't pretend surprise. "I know. This can't go anywhere. I know." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, not empty. Full. Jack swallowed. "I don't want to make this harder for you." "You didn't," Anna said. "You made it honest." They stood there with everything they weren't allowed to do pressed into the space between them. Then Jack turned and walked away, because wanting something didn't give him the right to take it. And Anna watched him go, knowing something had cracked, but also knowing she respected him more, not less, for leaving. Jack wasn't the only one. Thomas Crawford's oldest son, Robert, came home on leave from the Pacific that summer. 29 naval officer, tired in the way only long deployments produce. He came to the ranch on his second day home and met Maria Vogel. They spoke for 10 minutes, about nothing important, about everything that mattered. When Robert returned to his ship, he didn't write to Maria directly. Heck, no better. He wrote to his father and asked about her. Once. Then again. Thomas Crawford didn't miss the meaning. By August, similar stories were surfacing. Billy Carter, dependable, hovered near Greta Hoffman more than necessary. William Hart, the younger rancher from Broken Arrow, lingered near Lisa Werner when work didn't require it. Nothing improper, nothing physical. Just gravity, the kind that builds slowly until everyone feels it. Lieutenant Brennan saw it coming before Washington did. She didn't need reports to tell her what happens when people work together long enough under decent conditions. Proximity plus dignity produces familiarity. Familiarity produces empathy. Empathy produces attachment, and attachment doesn't ask permission from regulations. The first proposal arrived in late September. Jack Morrison didn't come on a Sunday. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, hat in his hands, standing in Brennan's office like a man about to jump. "I want to marry one of the prisoners," he said. Brennan didn't gasp, didn't interrupt. "Anna Clean," Jack added. "She's a prisoner of war," Brennan said carefully. No, and Germany is still technically at war with the United States. I know. This would require approvals from Washington, from the War Department, possibly the State Department. Then let's start. Jack lifted his eyes. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for process." Brennan leaned back, studying him. "You understand this could take months, and the answer may still be no. I'll take maybe never never." She picked up a form. The request went up the chain. 3 days later, Colonel Parker called. "One proposal," he said, voice tight. "I could explain away." Then he exhaled. "I have 6 more. From Camp Swift, 6 became 12. 12 became 37. 37 American men formally asking to marry German women prisoners. Washington didn't have a folder for that. They had no policy, which meant they had a problem. The second inspection arrived with weight. Not one officer, a team. Military, legal, federal. They took over an unused barracks and asked for everything. Files, reports, logs, statements. Lieutenant Brennan was interviewed for 3 straight days. They asked if she'd known relationships were forming. Yes. Why hadn't she intervened? Because nothing illegal occurred. Did she understand power imbalance concerns? Yes. Why allow the program to continue? Because treating people decently reduced risk, not increased it. They interviewed ranchers, asked direct questions. Had promises been made? Had favors been exchanged? Had pressure been applied? The answers were consistent. No coercion and no bargains. No exploitation. Just feelings no one had planned. Then they interviewed the women. The FBI agent sat across from Greta Hoffman for 2 hours. "Do you still believe in National Socialism?" he asked. Greta blinked, surprised by how distant the concept felt. "I believed what I was told," she said, "and then I lived somewhere that didn't match it." "What do you believe now?" "That propaganda works until reality interrupts it." The agent wrote that down, because it was the most honest answer he'd heard all week. The investigation ended with an unexpected conclusion. No violations serious enough to shut the program down. No evidence of manipulation. No security breaches. Just a pattern Washington hadn't anticipated. Decency worked better than control. The final report said it without saying it. Prisoners at Camp Swift showed lower ideological rigidity, higher cooperation, and 0 escape attempts. Colonel Parker called Brennan again. "Your program is being cited as effective," he said, like the word tasted strange. "And the marriages. The State Department is drafting a policy, meaning waiting periods, background checks, no ceremonies until formal peace treaties are signed." Brennan closed her eyes briefly. "So it's possible." "Yes," Parker said. "Possible." The news spread quietly. Some couples stepped back. The wait was too long. The uncertainty to heavy otorstajade. Jack and Anna did. They worked together without touching. Without promises. Hustbatians, Robert Crowford, kept writing letters. Thomas passed them on. Maria read them slowly, carefully, as if savoring words mattered. Christmas came cold. Camp Swift held a celebration. Not prisoners and civilians. Just people. German carols, mixed with English ones. Food filled the mess hall. Lieutenant Brennan stood in the doorway, watching a system she hadn't designed but had protected to become something human. Greta found her later. "Thank you," she said. "For what? For not keeping us enemies." Brennan answered honestly, "You did that part yourselves." And in that moment, both women understood something rare. This wasn't about romance. Romance was just the visible edge. This was about what happens when fear is replaced with ordinary life, long enough for truth to surface. And Washington could slow it, regulate it, paperwork it, but it could not undo it. Because by the time policy caught up, hearts already had. By the winter of 1945, Camp Swift no longer felt like a prison. The fences were still there. The rules were still there. But something invisible had changed. The German women no longer walked like people waiting to be punished. They walked like people waiting for the next chapter. Washington finally understood what Texas had already learned. These women were not being softened. They were being unmade and remade by ordinary life. The investigations ended quietly. No arrests. No shutdowns. No scandals. Just files closed with unfamiliar conclusions. Low risk. High cooperation. No ideological threat. What the reports never quite said was the truth. Kindness had done what fear never could. When marriage approvals finally arrived in early 1946, there were no celebrations at first. Just silence. Men reading letters twice, to be sure. Women holding papers with hands that shook. Permission didn't feel like victory. It felt like weight lifting off a chest that had been tight for years. Jack Morrison didn't propose again. He didn't need to. He stood on his land one afternoon, wildflowers in his hand, and asked Anna the simplest question he knew. "Ready to build something real?" She nodded. That was enough. The wedding wasn't big. No headlines, no speeches about history. Just people who had survived something terrible, choosing something ordinary. Work, home, belonging. Some women stayed. They became wives, neighbors, nurses, teachers. They learned English without losing German. They raised children who never learned to hate the way their mothers had been taught. Others returned to Germany. They carried something heavier than luggage. They carried proof. Proof that the enemy they were warned about did not exist the way propaganda said it did. Proof that dignity could survive even inside war. Years later, when Camp Swift closed, the land went quiet again. Barracks disappeared. Fences came down. Grass returned. But the effect never left. It lived in family names that sounded foreign at first, then normal. It lived in accents that faded across generations. It lived in a simple truth passed down at kitchen tables. I was once a prisoner here, and they treated me like a person. That was the part no weapon could destroy. History often remembers wars by who won, but the people who lived this story remembered something else. The moment enemies stopped being enemies, not because a treaty was signed, but because someone chose decency when cruelty would have been easier, that was the real ending. Not victory. Not defeat. Just people choosing to remain human, even when the world had given them every excuse not to.